Hi guys, welcome back. In this video, we're going to be looking at the limitations of free trade. In the previous video, we discussed the benefits of free trade. This video would be about the disadvantages or the limitations of free trade. Now, remember that free trade, although it brings benefits to the countries who specialize based on comparative advantage and then they trade, but it also has its own limitations, and because of those limitations, that is the reason that forces the governments to intervene. And we're going to be looking at those limitations in this video. But briefly, before going through the limitations, I will be going through the different types of options a government has in order to protect its domestic firms from free trade, because one of the significant disadvantages of free trade is that it destroys your domestic firms, because domestic firms can't survive foreign competition, so which is basically the infant industry argument that you will see. So there are different methods that the government may use to protect those domestic industries, and that is basically called trade protection. When the government protects its domestic firms from foreign competition, we are referring to as trade protection or trade barriers. So, any government policy that restricts free trade in order to protect the domestic industries from foreign competition is basically trade protection or imposing trade barriers. In other words, what we're saying is that instead of allowing the goods to move freely across the borders, export and import, the government deliberately interferes. And the reason is why, but why does it do so? The simple reason it does is because free trade has limitations. One of the primary limitations is that while we know that free trade would end up increasing overall efficiency, but it can hurt certain domestic industries. So government sometimes steps in to protect local producers and jobs, or to protect certain strategic sectors. They might be getting affected, right? So the most important method or the trade protection, which is actually, and this is very important because we need to look at the diagram for tariffs as well, is basically import tax and tariff. Now I'm going to be going through the diagram for tariff, and I'm going to be breaking down the tariff diagram in the next video, not in this video, because this video is about limitations of free trade. But tariff, one of the methods is tariff, which is simply a tax that is imposed on imported goods. So let's say a foreign producer can sell a phone of $500, let's say, in your country. So if the government of that country, of your country, basically places $100 tariff on that phone, the price increases to $600. Now what happens is that if the price goes up, imported goods become expensive, so the demand for imports will fall, right? And so and obviously government also ends up earning some tax revenue, tariff tax revenue, because tariff is simply an import tax. So government also earns some tax revenue, but we're going to be looking at all the how tariff works in detail in the next video. Now another method, so tariff is a tax on imports. The objective is to reduce the size of the imports through making the imports expensive. That is all that you need to know for this video. The second method is quotas. That is a restriction. So basically quota is a limit on the quantity of a good that can be imported. So because unlike in a tariff where the tariff charges the price through a tax, it makes the price expensive, a good expensive. A quota directly restricts supply. Quota will not make, quota is like you're restricting the quantity. So for example, a government may say only 100,000 foreign cars can enter the country this year. So it's not increasing the price of those cars, but what it's doing is that it's artificially restricting imports by saying that you can't really import more than this much cars, right? The supply of imports is artificially limited, and that obviously benefits domestic firms. So in tariffs, the government ends up earning revenue. With quotas, the government doesn't really earn revenue, right? So the third method is subsidy, and I'm going to be explaining quotas. Now these methods, that is quotas, these methods, just a second. These methods, that is quotas, subsidies, import bans, administrative barriers, and VER, voluntary export restriction, I'm going to be explaining them towards the end of the video, if I get the time. And so as far as the diagrams for these are concerned, you only need to learn the tariff diagram, right? You don't need to learn any other diagram. That's not really important. Tariff diagram is enough for the 12 marker, that's it. But you need to know what these are for explanations, and I'm going to be going through this either towards the end of the video or maybe the next video. But the next video will primarily, yes, focus on tariffs in proper detail. Now, coming to the third method, that is, instead of making imported goods expensive or reducing the supply or restricting the limiting imports, the government may give subsidies to domestic producer, which is a subsidy is a financial support given by the government to domestic firms. So instead of taxing the imports, the government supports the local firms directly. The government may say that we are giving you $50 per unit produced to the exporting firms, let's say. So the domestic exporters firms costs will fall, and they can sell the output at lower prices. You know, the government will not just give the exports. The government will not just give subsidies to exporters. It will also give subsidies to domestic firms, basically. So the domestic firms' costs will fall, and they can sell the goods at a lower price, and they become more. And because of that, the domestic firms' goods prices fall, and so they become competitive against imports. So what happens is that domestic output would increase and imports will fall because your domestic goods are becoming competitive against imports due to subsidies. And the consumers might end up paying slightly lower prices, but obviously the government must finance the subsidy through taxes. So, right. The fourth is import bans, also called embargoes. The government here is completely prohibiting the import of certain goods, and this is like an extreme form of protectionism. And there could be several reasons. There could be, maybe there are some health concerns related to that good, or maybe that good is dangerous to national security, or maybe you have political sanctions. Countries they impose sanctions, embargoes because of because of political sanctions, right? So, and because of that, what happens is that if you're imposing embargoes, which is you're banning the import, so or you're imposing political sanctions, so economically the economic impact would be that domestic producers would face no competition anymore, because what happens is that your there are no imports now coming into the country, so domestic producers don't have any foreign competition anymore. So obviously, yeah, so that's another way of protection. Another type of protection is administrative barriers, which are called non-tariff barriers, and these are regulations that make, and these are simply regulations and rules that make importing difficult without really explicitly banning trade. So the government is not saying that we are banning the trade. The government is saying, but we're going to make trading very difficult. So in effect, the government is saying that, okay, fine, we won't say that we're banning the trade, but we're going to make it very difficult for you to import. For example, the government may impose very, very, very strict safety standards on goods that are being imported, or very complex sort of custom procedures, right? Or maybe very strict licensing requirements to import goods, or maybe excessive paperwork involved to import goods. So all of these is making importing very difficult, and officially the government may justify it on the grounds of safety or quality, but in reality they often act as hidden protection. And what they do is that they increase the cost of importing, and um, uh, they increase the cost of importing, because your government is making imports very difficult, and it ends up reducing foreign competition, and it protects domestic firms in a way, right? So the other is voluntary export restraint. Here what the government does is that it is when an exporting country voluntarily agrees to limit exports to another country. So for example, let's say country A versus country B. So country A is exporting a lot of goods to country B, and domestic firms in country B are being threatened. So country B may request country A that please export less to us because all our domestic firms are being closing down. That's a voluntary export. So the country A may voluntarily restrict exports to country B. Right, so voluntary export restraint is when the exporting country voluntarily agrees to limit exports to other country. And although it sounds really nice and everything, but it's not that nice, because it sounds voluntary that country has voluntarily requested country B. Sorry. It sounds voluntary that country A has voluntarily restricted exports to country B, but it's usually under political pressure. Let's say country A is, let's say, Pakistan and country B is USA. Imagine USA is saying to Pakistan or requesting Pakistan to restrict exports to USA because you're threatening their firms. So obviously, our country would come under political pressure. So, uh, and I remember, Japan, limited car exports to the US in the 1980s. This is one example that you can give. So again, and effectively, this is actually like a quota because you're restricting the limiting exports. So this is just like limiting the supply of exports to another country. So in effect, it is not a quota, but this acts like a quota because you're restricting supply of exports to the other country on their request. So I've written it over here as well. You can go through it. So these are the different methods of trade protection, and I'm going to be going through more methods. Sorry, not more methods, but 2 to 3 of these methods, like quotas, and 1 to 2 more towards the end of the video again, in a bit more detail. Or if I feel the video got longer, then maybe in the next video. Which will also focus on tariffs, by the way, in the next video. But the primary topic of today's video, or the video that you're watching, is to sort of go through the limitations of free trade. And remember, guys, that the limitations of free trade are actually the reasons why trade barriers are imposed. Right? So let's look at that. Now, guys, let's start with the limitations of free trade. And what you need to know, students, is that, in theory, we study that free trade sounds great, right? And countries specialize according to comparative advantage, and, the world output increases, and, the world efficiency increases. Consumers enjoy lower prices, enjoy more variety, higher living standards. But here, the important thing here in economics is that, okay, fine, free trade does definitely maximize global efficiency, but the bad thing is that it does not guarantee fairness. It does not guarantee stability or equal benefits for everyone within the country, because some people benefit while a lot may lose. Like domestic firms may suffer. So the outcomes aren't really fair for everyone. They're not, people aren't really getting equal benefits. Consumers certainly benefiting, but domestic firms are not. Right? So we can't really say that outcomes are, stable and fair for everyone. And this is exactly where the problem begins. And this is exactly why the government needs to step up now and intervene. And so the first argument that is given in favor of trade protection, see, the limitations of free trade are exactly the arguments in favor of trade protection. Sometimes the question could ask you about they could ask you, or you might need to mention the limitations of free trade, but sometimes, depending upon the question, the same limitations of free trade are also the arguments in favor of trade protection, or why trade protection is imposed because of limitations of free trade. And the first very important argument is infant industry argument, and this is a key word, infant industry argument. These 3 words are very key to writing in the exam. Very important, very powerful. Infant industry argument. See, infant industries are those industries that are too young to compete with large established foreign firms. See, sometimes a country has the potential to develop these new industries, but these industries are too small and young to compete with large established foreign firms if you're importing goods from other countries of these foreign firms. You think about it yourself. See, if a developing, and this, look at it from the perspective of a developing country. If a developing country opens up completely to free trade, then what happens? Local firms would face giant multinational companies. And foreign firms are large firms. They benefit from significant economies of scale, and they have better technology, better resources, they have better access to finance. But our domestic firms doesn't have all of that. So domestic firms may collapse before they even get a chance to grow. So the government then intervenes by introducing tariffs or quotas, or maybe giving subsidies to our domestic firms. And this trade protection is not done to permanently block trade, but it is done to give some temporary protection, so the industry, our domestic local industry, can grow and achieve economies of scale and improve its productivity, and even eventually then compete globally. Now, a lot of students would end up just saying infant industry argument and it's done to protect domestic firms. Okay, fine, but elaborate it a bit, especially for a 12 marker, that it's given to not to block trade but to give temporary protection to the industry. That's what I said. So that they may end up achieving their economies of scale They may improve their own productivity and eventually compete globally as well. And if this protection is not given, without this trade protection, some industries may never ever develop and may be forced to shut down before they even develop, right? Now, one of the limitation or an argument that is given against this, point is that, you know, sometimes when you're protecting these domestic firms, it may, and you're doing it for a very long period of time, because you're imposing protectionism because of the infant industry argument, especially if you're doing it for a very long term, it may result into complacency and it may result into complacency, right? And the key term, protectionist dependency, right? Which means that you're not trying to, that these infant industries, small firms might not try to become competitive, and they may become complacent and dependent on trade protection. Right? Because by protecting them, you are actually giving them some room to become inefficient in the long run. If you will just keep on doing that, right? Protecting domestic firms and protecting infant industries, right? Also, a large argument that is given is that we said that infant industries and developing economies might suffer. I mean, not just developing, but developed as well. But then this argument is given especially for developing economies, that if developing economies are imposing trade barriers, do they really have the international power to enact tariffs and quotas, especially against large developed countries? I mean, do you think Pakistan can impose a tariff on US imports? Look at us, right? I mean, look at the economic power that we hold right now, right? So whether developing countries have the international power to enact imposing or to impose protectionism, especially on developed economies like the USA, and you think if Pakistan imposes heavy tariffs on USA won't retaliate. So you can't. A big argument given against this point is that, do developing countries have the international power to enact such protectionism on developing countries without really risking retaliatory protectionism from them? So that's a big assumption that you're making, right? You need to get your reality and facts checked in. So the reality is that it will have damaging repercussions, and if you impose protectionism, there would be retaliation, tit for tat retaliation, right? The second very important point that is given in favor of trade protection, and which is a limitation of free trade, is that it's done to protect it's done for the protection of employment, because free trade and this is a disadvantage, that free trade results into unemployment in domestic firms, because free trade can destroy jobs, especially in uncompetitive industries. I mean, these uncompetitive industries would be completely wiped out of the map, right? Like never existed. I mean, just imagine cheap imports entering your country. So domestic firms lose market share then, and firms shut down, workers lose jobs, and the kind of unemployment that results is structural unemployment. Remember that because of cheaper imports, that results in structural unemployment. Firms shut down, workers lose jobs. So unemployment will rise, communities would suffer, and political pressure would increase, on the government as well to do something about it. So governments would then introduce trade barriers to protect domestic jobs, prevent this sort of structural unemployment from happening, and maintain social stability. So although workers may switch, I mean, if workers are unemployed, you can say that in the long run they may switch industries. So resources might reallocate in the long run, but what about the short run? There would be unemployment in the short run. And also this reallocation adjustment takes time. So workers cannot instantly switch industries, right? So the thing is, the fact of the matter is that yes, it would result in unemployment, structural unemployment, right? The third argument that is given in favor of trade protection, which is actually a disadvantage of free trade as well, that if you are writing this point as a disadvantage of free trade, you will say free trade results in dumping, free trade results in employment. The infant industry argument says that it results in infant industry shutting down, closing down, right? But if you're writing it as an argument in favor of trade protection, so you'll say that it is done in order for the protection of employment, for the prevention of dumping, if you're giving this as a reason for argument in favor or support of trade protection. Now, what is dumping? Dumping is a practice Dumping occurs when foreign firms sell the goods, right, at very, very low prices, very low, extremely low prices, sometimes even below the cost of production. And by the way, China does that. China does dumps its goods in, especially in Asian countries. And the USA has been accusing China because been a trade war between USA and China since 2019. And post Donald Trump, I mean, though that trade war, we all witnessed it last year as well, and that increased. But why do countries dump their goods in international markets? Simply to eliminate domestic competitors and gain monopoly power. So let's say this is country A and this is country B. So country A may dump its goods in country B so that all the firms in country B might just shut down and close, and it gains monopoly in country B as well, and it gains a market share, a huge market share in country B. And China does that. So if local, and that's called dumping, that is selling at very, very low prices or sometimes even below cost. That's what you need to write. And it is done to eliminate domestic competitors and gain monopoly power, and that's unfair competition, right? So if local firms will collapse because of that, the foreign firms may later. And by the way, it's not that they will always be selling at lower prices. Once the local firms are eliminated from the market, they would again increase the prices. The foreign firms may later raise prices. So governments impose anti-dumping duties like tariffs and all to prevent this unfair sort of competition and protect domestic producers and domestic firms. Because when you're doing free trade between two countries, see, free trade assumes fair competition, and dumping is not a fair competition. It's unfair competition, and dumping sort of distorts that assumption of fair competition. So that's why. But and because of dumping, industries would shut down, local firms would be wiped out of the market, and again that would result in structural unemployment, and that will also result in a lot of anger against the local political establishment if no action is taken against the countries that are accused of dumping, right? And maybe the dumped goods are also not only competitive and very in price because they're selling it at a very low price, but maybe better in quality as well, maybe. But the thing with dumping is that dumping is extremely difficult to prove, because finding the information regarding cost of production of that particular country's goods and proving that the products have been purposefully sold at very low prices below cost is a real challenge for the World Trade Organization, WTO, who governs the global trade. See, WTO governs global trade. So any grievances you take to the WTO, World Trade Organization. So it's difficult to prove dumping, and if you know uh, so countries would, the thing is that if you impose a tariff, if protectionist measures are imposed by a country, such as tariffs are imposed by a country due to perceived dumping, let's say the country was perceiving that the other country had dumped its goods in its domestic markets, and that had resulted in domestic firms closing down. So, and if that country takes protectionist measures against that country, and by the way, you know that dumping wasn't really proved, right? But it was perceived dumping, and based on perceived dumping you impose tariffs, then the accused country who has been accused of dumping may feel wrongly targeted, and it may retaliate heavily in return, which may lead to tit for tat protectionism. The other country may retaliate, tit for tat protectionism. For example, if you imposed a tariff on them for 10%, they may retaliate by imposing 15%. And no one benefits in this way. Neither you are benefiting, in fact, you are worse off now, because they now impose a heavier tariff on you. And imagine if you were a developing country, what will you do now? So, tit for tat protectionism, if this starts happening, then the real benefits of protectionism are, uh, you know, distorted, and this is just like unintended consequence because no one benefits in that way, right? So therefore it could be argued that trade talks through the World Trade Organization is a better option to resolve such disputes diplomatically rather than engaging in a trade war, because tit for tat protection is a trade war, because it's better to handle such disputes diplomatically through the World Trade Organization rather than engaging in a trade war that will only harm international relations between these two countries or any two countries in the long term, right? So, and by the way, these three are very important reasons that you should be giving in the exams, right? Now, guys, the fourth point says national security concerns, and this is again another reason why governments may impose trade barriers, because when and which is actually a limitation for free trade as well. There could be national security concerns because, see, when we talk about free trade, we usually say that countries should specialize and then import goods that other countries can produce more efficiently than you. But that works well in normal times, and it does. But the problem arises when we start talking about essential goods. When we're talking about essential goods, that's when the problem arises. Essential goods are those goods without things a country simply cannot survive without, right? So, for example, think about defense equipment, military equipment, food, or energy. Now imagine a country imports almost all of its food or oil. It imports all of its food or oil. So in peaceful times, this might be cheaper and more efficient to import oil and import food. I mean, right? Because the other country might be more efficient than you producing it yourself. But what happens if there is a war or political tension? So, or some sort of external shocks, right? Uh, or maybe there are global supply chain disruptions like we saw during COVID-19 and post Russia Ukraine war. So suddenly the exporting country that you were importing from, that country might stop supplying to you. Then what will you do? Ships might not move anymore. Trade routes might be blocked. And because of, maybe, let's say, global supply chain disruptions due to wars, maybe prices for oil might skyrocket, right? They may increase very much. And if that happens, the country that depends entirely on imports is in serious trouble. It may not have enough food for its population then. It may not have the fuel to run electricity or transport. It may not have the defense equipment that it was importing. All of the defense equipment. Why was it importing all of it? You should have produced some. But you say no, competitive advantage says that you are not good at producing defense equipment. You don't have the lower opportunity cost, so let import all of it from the other countries. Okay, fine. Now trade routes are blocked. You are at war with the other country. Maybe what are you, or diplomatic relations get affected, or any external shock, you're gone. You're dead. Now what happens? So now you don't have enough defense equipment to protect yourself. So in such situation, the issue is not about which country can produce it better or who is offering a lower price or a competitive price. I mean, now the issue becomes about survival and security. So governments sometimes protect domestic firms, like we were importing oil from abroad, we were importing all food, we were importing all military equipment, but we could have also made it ourselves. So the government will try to support our domestic industries, that you make military equipment, you produce food. So the government sometimes protect our domestic industries by imposing tariffs on imports or giving subsidies to domestic firms, and this allows the domestic firms to survive even if they are less efficient. And it's okay. I mean, the country might produce food or oil inefficiently, but in return it gains some sort of self-sufficiency and some sort of strategic independence as well. It's not just reliant completely on others. So in other words, you're sacrificing some efficiency because you're producing it inefficiently, but then you also need to reduce your own vulnerability, and you need to also protect yourself in times of crisis. So this is all pure economics that we're talking about right now. Also, the prevention of overdependence point is also somehow linked to the fourth point as well, because when the country follows free trade, it specializes in what it produces best, and this is basically the idea of competitive advantage. But again, like I said, sometimes this specialization may become too extreme, which means that a country may end up depending heavily on just one export of the product. That is, it's just depending heavily on the export of oil, cotton, or let's say tea. Or it may rely mainly on, or one way to say it is, it's just relying mainly on one trading partner, like a single. So you're relying on major exports. You're relying on one or two exports and then also to only one major trading partner. What if he backs out later on? What will you do now? So if you're just relying on mainly on one trading partner, like a single major country buying most of your exports, now this is creating a risk. So we need to impose barriers. See, barrier doesn't just means reducing, restricting imports. It also means protecting domestic firms to maybe give them some sort of advantage and diversifying your own, you know, range, because you can't just depend on one country. So what you're saying is that now you have a risk because you were too dependent on the export of just one two goods, and you were overly dependent on one trading partner, and now you have a risk because if, let's say, the global price of that particular product that you were selling to the other country, let's say you are country A and you're selling everything, let's say you're selling tea to country B only, instead of 10 more other countries, you're only selling it to country B, and country B is buying all your tea to country A, all of your tea from country A, country B is buying, you know. But what if, let's say, I mean, what if, I mean, so all of your GDP is primarily coming from exports, but what if the global price of tea falls? So most of your GDP and employment was coming from the export of tea, and now the global price of tea falls, and now you are in trouble now. So if the global price of that product suddenly falls, the country's export earnings would just collapse. Or let's say if the world demand for tea falls, then incomes would drop significantly in your country. Or let's say if diplomatic relations with that country was buying all your product, worsen with that main trading partner, then trade may stop or reduce sharply. So in all these cases, your economy would become unstable, right? So the government unemployment would rise, GDP would growth would slow down, and this will actually weaken your currency as well. Your currency will weaken as well, because when your exports will fall, it will weaken your currency, your exchange rate. It will weaken your currency. So, okay, fine, we do say that specialization enhances efficiency, but too much dependence on, comparative advantage theory, or too much dependence on just export of one good based on specialization, and that too to just one country, makes the country vulnerable to, external shocks like maybe bad diplomatic relations, or external shocks like fall in world demand to your product. What the world demand for that falling world demand for tea or falling world demand for your product is an external shock, right? So that is why the government sometimes use trade protection to encourage diversification, meaning that they support other industries, other domestic industries. They're not trying to put all eggs in one basket. That's what I'm saying. They support other industries so the economy does not put all its eggs in one basket. Right? Another point that is very important is that the government might impose trade protection to raise government, revenue generation. In many developing countries, tax systems are very weak. So income tax collection is very difficult. But tariffs are easy to collect, especially at the ports when goods come in your country. So trade protection becomes a source of government revenue, and this is more common, especially in lower income economies. So that's again another reason for trade protection, right? Another very, very, very important reason that all I should have written at the start, but it's written at the end, is to eliminate a current account deficit. To improve a balance of payment position, to eliminate your current account deficit. Current account, we'll be studying in balance of payment, but I'm sure that by now you know what a current account is, where your trade, export and import of goods are recorded. So if you have a current account deficit, meaning let's say your imports are more than your exports, and now you want to boost exports and lower your imports, so you impose trade barriers, and obviously you want to promote economic growth as well. So that is why. So what protectionism policies would do is that protectionist policies will either increase the price of imported goods through tariffs, or simply block imports from entering the country, thus reducing the expenditure on imports. That's what protectionism policy would do. It would reduce your imports. So you are actually reducing imports here. You are reducing imports, right? Reducing imports to improve your current account position, which is in a deficit right now, right? So trade balance of the current account would improve, hence rectifying the current account deficit, right? So let's say if your exports do not change, if you don't work on exports, but let's assume that M goes down. So if M goes down, while X is, let's say, constant, so again net exports would rise, right? So if net exports increase with improvements in the current account position, and net exports are a component of aggregate demand. So if this improves because of fall, see, if imports fall, withdrawals on the circular flow fall. So net exports improve, and that would improve aggregate demand in the AD equation. I mean, AD would go up. That will actually boost economic growth and boost GDP if net exports go up. So GDP will rise, economic growth, right? But again, the problem is that if you impose trade barriers, if you're using protectionism policies to, let's say, close a trade deficit, the disadvantage of this is that you may face retaliation from trading partners, because countries will frown upon the fact that their economy and exporters are made to suffer due to a trade deficit in a different country. I mean, and they may not react very kindly to any sort of protectionism that is imposed on them. So they will impose it on you as well. So retaliation would take place on the initial country who had initiated this trade protection. And if their retaliatory tariffs are stronger than yours, then if they now listen to this, you impose a 10% tariff on them, they impose a 20% tariff on you, you're dead. Why? Because 10% tariff on them was imposed in order to reduce imports, to improve current account position, to reduce the current account deficit. They impose a 20% tariff on your exports because your exports are their imports. Your exports are their imports. They impose 20% on you, so your exports went down massively now. So things didn't improve, it worsened. It worsened, right? Your current account deficit worsened. So if protectionism culminates into some sort of tit for tat, punitive sort of retaliation. Punitive retaliation means it is retaliation that is intended as punishment, that like what we were witnessing recently after Trump's administration, imposing tariffs as a punishment. So you're right. So that's the reason why countries impose trade protection, and this is actually one of the reason why. This is actually a reason why, because of the limitation of free trade, because free trade would result into a current account deficit. If you're importing freely from other countries and you don't have trade barriers, then it will result in a current account deficit. This is a disadvantage, and the reason for trade protection would be to eliminate that deficit. But if you're writing this as a limitation of free trade, you will say that it results in a current account deficit. And not only that, it reduces economic growth as well. Why? Because if you're importing, let's say, and if let's say your exports are less than your imports, then net exports may go down, resulting into a current account deficit, and this may weaken aggregate demand, result slowing down economic growth. Real GDP will fall. A negative output gap might result in, especially if you are a heavily open economy, maybe you're very heavy open economy. Open economy is an economy that relies heavily on international trade. So if you're relying heavily on international trade, so net exports falling could worsen things for you, for your economy's GDP. Got it, guys? Now we're going to be keeping the video till here. Now in the next, I'm going to be, by the way, attaching a few notes here from your textbook. Go through that, pretty simple stuff. In the next video, we're going to be discussing slightly more detail about quotas and the diagram for tariffs in the next video. I'll see you all in the next video. Thank you so much for watching. Until then, take care.